I took, kind of, given the circumstances, an opportunity to reflect, as so many of us have, on what Steve Jobs means to our industry. And in particular, I thought I'd talk this morning about what Android can learn from Steve Jobs. When you think about Steve, you know, maybe one of the first words that comes to mind is design. He was a master of design. He reintroduced design and the value of design into the computer industry in a way that just completely has transformed our industry. But, you know, Google's doing okay there. You know, if you look at the lineup of Android phones, they're looking pretty darn good. And, you know, there's even a recent review I saw of the Nexus Prime where somebody said the UI is a lot more sophisticated and clean, making even iOS look old and clunky. So is that really the right lesson that, hey, let's go compete on design? Let's see if we can be as good as Apple? Now, I think obviously competition is great, and trying to be good at what somebody else is good at is always worthwhile. That we can inspire each other to be better. But Steve had something much more profound to say about design. And you know, you kind of see this in the lesson of Sun Tzu. He said, avoid strength, attack weakness. And you know, when you compare, for example, the Chrome netbook with the MacBook Air, you know, it's a tough sell to say we can be as good as Apple at the showmanship of design. But instead, the Chrome netbook plays to Google's strengths. You know, it's a cloud device. And I think that's a really important lesson for Android. And that's really what Steve had to say about design. It's a wonderful interview from 2000, I think it was with Forbes, but it was quoted in the New York Times the other day. He said, in most people's vocabularies, design means veneer. It's interior decorating. It's the fabric of the curtains and the sofa. But to me, nothing could be further from the truth, from the meaning of design. Design is the fundamental soul of a man-made creation that ends up expressing itself in successive outer layers of the product or service. That's a wonderful, wonderful insight. And I know I personally have been thinking about that more than anything else in the wake of Steve's passing. It's ultimately a message about being true to yourself, being true to your strengths. And I think of how many of the products that we've done at O'Reilly that I'm proudest of have been ones that came from our unique sensibility, reflected all the way through the fundamental soul of a creation that we're making that ends up expressing itself in successive outer layers of the product or service. And so you have to ask, you know, what is the fundamental soul of Google? And you know, early on, we heard this slogan, access to all the world's information. It's been reiterated again and again in Sergey's 2010 Founders Letter. Larry and Sergey alternate every year writing one of these letters. Sergey wrote, we founded Google to help connect people to the information they need, and we have been obsessively focused on that goal ever since. That's a huge part of the fundamental soul of Google. And anything Android should be expressing that soul if we're really going to think about competing with Apple on design. Now, if you look at actually Google's marketing on Google for Android, you'll actually see that that is in fact a lot of the positioning. Of course, this is a page that's focused on Google Apps, but it really is about access to information. But you know, Google's passion for access to information actually goes deeper than just giving access to these sort of very successful products. You know, the thing that I admire so much about Google is how much that fundamental soul expresses itself in products that don't have necessarily short-term gain. You know, so again, from Sergey's Founders Letter, he talks about Google Translate. Now works in 58 languages, including Hindi, Persian, Swahili. Can offer translations between 3,306 language pairs. It's still far from perfect, but we've come a long, long way. He talks about geographic information, you know, the huge investment that Google has made in getting imagery and cars and the whole street maps thing. And now the street maps thing, of course, leads me to something really, really interesting, which is something I've been kind of obsessing a little bit about lately, which is the autonomous vehicle. Now, you guys remember back in 2005 when there was a bit of a furor when the DARPA Grand Challenge for autonomous vehicles was won by Stanley, the car from Stanford. But you guys remember that that car took 7 hours to drive a 7-mile course? That's 6 years ago. Now, earlier this year, the Google autonomous vehicle was unveiled, and Google pointed out that it had driven hundreds of thousands of miles in ordinary traffic. What's the difference? Now, Peter Norvig, in a different context, once said, we don't have better algorithms, we just have more data. And what's really interesting about the Google autonomous vehicle is that the data that it's relying on was gathered by human Street View drivers. Because what happened when they went out and did Street View, they weren't just capturing images of the buildings along the street. They weren't just capturing stray Wi-Fi packets. They were measuring everything. You know, that little laser thing on the top of the Street View cars is getting very precise measurements to everything. And one of the things that Peter said to me when I was sort of drilling down on how this worked was that he said it's a kind of hard AI problem to pick a traffic light out of a video stream. But it's a very trivial problem to figure out if it's red or green if you already know that it's there. And what strikes me as so fascinating about that is that this is a culmination of an idea that we've seen throughout the history of computing coming into fruition with the web, and in particular in these huge applications that I named Web 2.0 some years ago, which is this idea of human-computer symbiosis, collective intelligence, and this idea that the difference between the Google autonomous vehicle and the Stanley, the DARPA Grand Challenge winner, is not AI algorithms. It's that the Google car is remembering the activity of augmented human drivers. So it's human-computer symbiosis at the heart of things. So that's kind of an interesting lesson to take. If this is the soul of Google, to kind of do these really things that push the envelope of human-computer symbiosis in the pursuit of access to all the world's information, that's a really good lesson to take to your own work with Android. I have this idea, and I've fascinated for years with these images of routing maps of the internet and how much they look like neuronal maps of the brain. They're nowhere near as dense yet as a neuronal map. Actually, it was great. I saw a presentation by a neurology researcher, and he showed one that looked very like this. And he said, of course, the stain we're using only gets to a fraction of 1% of the neurons, so in reality, it's much more dense. So you kind of, the ones that look like, the images that we see of the brain that look like this are actually only a fraction of 1%. But we're getting there. So we're building this network-mediated global mind in which we are all connected by our communications devices, by the internet, by the phone. It's not this artificial intelligence, as in Skynet. It's us, augmented. And so if you start to think about the phone as an augmentation device, something that makes us smarter, that connects us to information, that connects us to the world, you'll think very differently about what kind of applications you build and what's the ultimate soul of that device than if you think that it's maybe a platform for playing Angry Birds. So, think about access to information. Think about sensors, because that's the cutting edge of this human-computer symbiosis. And think about how those two things work together to enhance our connections and our collective intelligence. So, if you look at some of the investments in mobile that we've made at our venture firm, O'Reilly AlphaTech Ventures, Foursquare, you see this theme: sensors, local data, social connection. Runkeeper, sensors, personal data, social connection, quantified self. SeeClickFix, sensors, civic data, social connection. These are all about using sensors to enhance people, to make more connection. Now, I'm not saying these are the only kinds of apps to build, but what I am saying is that these are apps that are in some sense consistent with this fundamental vision of this phone as an information and connectivity device, and not just as a slick fashion accessory, not just as a slick platform for playing games, but something much, much deeper. And I think through pursuing that vision more wholeheartedly, Google will bring Android into areas that are not necessarily going to be matched by the competition because they don't have that long-term vision. You know, there's so many things that Google does, like translate, like the autonomous vehicle. People scratch their heads saying, well, how are they going to make money at that? All right? And it's not because they're coming from making money. It's because they're coming from the fundamental soul of Google, of what it is, in the same way that the work of Apple comes from Steve's fundamental soul. And you see this in another of Sergey's founders' letter. He wrote, "The dark clouds currently looming over the world's economy are hardship for us all. But by the time today's children grow up, this recession will be a footnote in history. Yet the technologies that we create between now and then will define their way of life." This is a statement that Google really believes that we are building the future. And that's why I love this company. They are working on a long-term vision of the future of our society. They're thinking big thoughts. I use the phrase, work on stuff that matters, and I hope that all of you in your work developing for Android are thinking about that as well. Now, a big part of working on stuff that matters is simply creating value for others. I came across this wonderful graph from Vision Mobile, which was showing the correlation between the number of devices sold and the number of apps available. And there's an R-squared of about 0.96 or 0.97. But what's also really striking when you see here is just, you know, how fast Android is growing, the number of apps is keeping pace. And that's really a fundamental statement about value creation and about the strength of an ecosystem play. Apple introduced this idea of the platform for developers on the phone. Everything before that was, kind of in the dust now. And we've now seen why these are the two platforms that matter, because they have attracted the most developers. And it's pretty clear that there's something about the Android strategy that's making it grow even faster than the iPhone. And I think it's about value creation. But there's some lessons, again, from Steve. Steve talks about the value that he's creating from others. Remember, this is pretty early on. He said, we've got $1 billion paid to developers. More recently, it was $4 billion. Now, I think it's kind of interesting. Apple's profits in the last quarter were over $7 billion. And this is the cumulative amount paid out to developers through the history of iPhone. So no question that Steve has produced enormous value for Apple. But this wonderful storytelling about the value created for others is part of that Apple mystique. And it's interesting, Google does this around search. There's a really interesting report that Hal Varian, Google's chief economist, has done for the last couple of years on the economic impact across America of Google search advertising. I think they calculated something like $64 billion of economic impact in 2010. And, again, in Sergey's 2010 Founders letter, there are all these stories about people's success via Google advertising, how it enhanced their business. And my question is, where is the equivalent storytelling for Android? I haven't heard it. Maybe you have. I think it's a really important lesson for Google to tell the story of value creation. You see it in the increased profits of carriers, which, of course, not our favorite necessarily people to see profiting from this, but they're a huge part of the healthy ecosystem. I saw a recent story estimating that Verizon's uptick in profits were actually due to their Android commitment. But we need to hear about it for developers. We need to hear about it for users, because there's a really important lesson here. This comes from Kurt Vonnegut in his book Mother Night. He used this as a cautionary tale. But I actually have always taken this quote in the other way. He says, "You are what you pretend to be, so be careful what you pretend." And I've always thought that if we pretend to be better than we are, the world will hold us to what we say about ourselves. And that's why Google's statement of their fundamental goal, which they made in their original IPO registration statement, and many times since, "Don't be evil," is so important. Because they held themselves up to a higher standard than other companies. They pretend to be something, another way to say it is they aspire to be something that was really unheard of in American business. And I want us, as a community, to hold them to that pretension. I want all of us together to say, yes, we want you to be what you have told us you are. And so that brings me to another lesson from Steve Jobs that you might take, and that is control. Steve was famously controlling of media, of the design of the product, of everything vertical integration. Apple is an amazing testament to the power of control. And yet, Google has expressed very clearly that they want to apply the open access principles of the interface of the internet to increase user choice and innovation in the mobile space. That's Larry Page from his founder's letter in 2007. And of course, we see that playing out. Here's a quote recently in a GigaOM story from Lior Romano, who was the CEO and co-founder of an application called Contaps. He said, and the story says, building an Android offered more access to the core functions of the phone, the ability to integrate with more third-party APIs and good tools to build with. He was worried about Apple stifling the app because it might be too close to iOS native functions. He said, we want to be a one-stop shop for contacts and integration. That's a big goal, and we need the openness of Android to undertake those possibilities. With Android, you get a lot of access from Google and the opportunity to build something big, not something skin deep. That's actually a statement of the value of letting go of control. And, but there's really a battle for, in some ways, the soul of Google. And it comes out, it's interesting because in Vic Gundotra's keynote at Google I/O last year, he said, if Google didn't act, it faced a draconian future where one man, one phone, one carrier were our choice. That's a future we don't want. So if you believe in openness, if you believe in choice, if you believe in innovation from everyone, then welcome to Android. And John Gruber of Daring Fireball contrasted this with a recent quote from Business Week, where he said, from now on, companies hoping to receive early access to Google's most up-to-date software will need approval of their plans, and they will seek that approval from Andy Rubin, the head of Google's Android group. That seems to me like Google is on the verge or flirting with taking the wrong lesson from Steve, taking the lesson of control rather than hewing to their own fundamental soul, their own fundamental goal of openness. And Marco Garganta talked about this in a webcast he did for O'Reilly Media, what it means to be open and why you would care. And he talked about 3 pillars of open source, open standards, and community leadership. He pointed out that Google's doing pretty well on the first 2. The third one, Google is actually playing it pretty close to the vest. And I think it's really important to consider success stories. You look at the Apache Software Foundation. These guys say, we consider ourselves not simply a group of projects sharing a server, but rather a community of developers and users. And it's kind of amazing. Here is a project with an open license, with huge amount of opportunity for anybody to fork it, and yet people don't. Why? Because there's this enormous community authority that comes from the shared enterprise. You contrast that with what happened with Java, where Sun was kind of talked open, but didn't really become open. They ended up getting in a big battle with IBM over control. They never quite had the legitimacy that comes from real community involvement. And now you see people like Amazon getting deep into Android territory, and you wonder if we're going to see a repeat of the missed opportunity that was Java. From a company that started out with a vision of openness, but wasn't quite sure about what that meant and didn't live as fully in that vision as they need to. And this kind of brings me to something I wrote about back in 2007 when I went to do a conference called Money Tech on Wall Street. And I was really interested in learning what could we take back to the web economy from watching Wall Street, which of course was a much bigger economy. And what I learned was rather alarming, and of course it's played out in the years since. It came from a conversation with Bill Janeway, who was a former vice chairman of Warburg Pincus. He said, Wall Street originally used to serve its customers, and at some point it began trading against its clients. And of course we saw the ultimate outcome of that game. And it struck me that this is also a war that we see play out in the technology industry, where companies start fighting against their developer community. And this really goes against that soul of Google. So I guess that is my ultimate advice from Steve Jobs to Android, which is be true to Google's fundamental soul. Don't lose your way. Don't compete with developers. Figure out how to build an inclusive community. And that's what this conference is all about. We're really trying to build a conference that's by, for, and of the Android developer and user and OEM community. Thank you very much.